As Liz mentioned, my name is Taylor Zielkowski. I'm an EarthSoft sales representative for the states west of the Colorado Rockies and then into the Asia Pacific. I saw some familiar names on the attendee sheet today, so hello to you who I have not talked to in a while. Also, as Liz mentioned, this is the first in a three-part series of Back to Basics, talking about the EQuIS Data Processor, or EDP. And today I'm going to take you through a couple of items. What is EDP? Why do we use EDP? And then we're going to walk through an EDP end-to-end workflow, both in slide format and walking through one of the actual EDP applications itself. So we'll go ahead and get started here with what is EDP. EDP is largely considered the traffic cop that enforces data quality before data are allowed into EQuIS. So EDP's objective is to verify the completeness of each electronic data deliverable, whether it be field data, lab data, or another data type, and ensure that each EDD conforms to your quality standards before the data are loaded and before they're allowed into EQuIS. So what does this mean in terms of quality standards? We divide these into two categories, both formatting and logic, and some examples of these include reference values. So this is one of the most obvious checks that EDP will run, making sure that the reference values in the EDD that are submitted by either a laboratory or a field tech are in agreement with the reference values in your database and in your reference value file. So we're showing as an example here the infamous GW versus WG groundwater matrix code dilemma. So if EDP finds an instance of GW or an invalid reference value in your EDD, it will call that out, throw an error, and allow you to fix it in place or fix it externally and then resubmit your EDD. So this is an example of how EDP is enforcing those reference values to ensure that all of the values in your database are consistent and queryable. The next item that EDP will check for will be orphan records. So we want to make sure that each sample has an associated analysis and each analysis has an associated analyte that makes sense. So in this case, for this example, we can see over here we have metals and pH. We have mercury and selenium, which go great with our metals. We have a pH reading, which goes great with our pH analysis. But EDP sees nitroglycerin over on the right-hand side, and it does not see a related analysis. So in this case, it may be looking for an 8330 or an 8021, but it does not see that. So it's going to throw an error as an orphan record and let the data submitter know that there is an orphan record and that this specific analyte does not have an associated analysis and therefore does not have an associated sample. The next check that EDP will run will be field lengths and other database rules. So not only the length of each field, but the actual field type. If it's a date field, a time field, if it's varchar, if it's numeric, EDP will check and enforce those rules to make sure that the data deliverable conforms to those database rules before it lets the data into EQuIS. It's important to note here that you see in this example, for instance, sys sample code is a varchar field with 40 characters. You can actually customize these field lengths to meet the needs of your specific project and your specific EQuIS database. They just can't exceed the maximum field length for each field in EQuIS. And finally, another example of the quality checks or quality standards enforced by EDP are required and dependent fields. So our example here shows a sample record with a start depth and without an end depth. And so EDP is throwing an error saying you must have an end depth. The specific check is actually if start depth is not null, the end depth must be greater than the start depth. So this is an example of both a required and dependent field based on the start depth having been populated. So in terms of the EQuIS workflow view, on the left-hand side, we see all of our data input engines, whether it's field data collection going in through Edge or EQuIS Collect, sensors and data logger information being ported into EQuIS via telemetry, laboratories generating an EDD out of their LIMS and checking it in Standalone EDP, process monitoring, or inspections. All of these workflows, all of these data inputs have an associated EDD format that works with EDP to allow EDP to verify that the data included in each of them are complete and that they comply with your quality standards. So in the middle of this slide here, the red square, this represents the EDP, the EQuIS data processor, which again is the traffic cop enforcing data quality before any data are allowed into the EQuIS database. So once they pass these checks and they reside in the EQuIS schema, we can be confident that that they are of a known integrity and that you can use them for decision-making purposes. And this may be via professional data analysis and reporting, displaying your data in your enterprise web dashboards, configuring EIAs or EQuIS information agents for automated notifications, or connecting or interfacing with any of the third-party visualization and analysis platforms that EQuIS allows you to interface with. So we want to make sure that before we start building maps, putting reports together, and creating or generating our final deliverables, that the data are of a known quality. And by enforcing that, EDP helps us understand exactly the quality checks and the audit trail that exists on each one of those data packages, so we know and we're confident in the quality and the integrity of those data before we start making decisions on them. So this slide here shows EDP's relationship to each data type as well as to the EQuIS database schema. So the EQuIS database schema resides here at the center of the universe. On the left-hand side, we have the first part of our dual user interface, EQuIS Professional. And then on the right-hand side, we have EQuIS Enterprise. Each of these applications or each of these pieces of the EQuIS dual user interface has its own version of EDP that functions differently, and we'll walk through those workflows here in just a few minutes. So EDP Professional as well as EDP Enterprise will both perform checks on the data before they are allowed into the database. And then in the upper left-hand corner, we also have Edge, which has its own version of Field EDP, and we'll walk through that workflow here in just a few minutes as well. So this is a great slide to see exactly where the data are checked at each juncture by EDP and how EDP enforces the data quality before the data are allowed into the EQuIS database central schema. So in terms of workflow, standalone EDP and professional EDP are very similar applications. Standalone EDP is largely for data submitters, whether you're a laboratory that needs to check an EDD before you deliver it to your client, or if you are a consultant working for a government agency and you're submitting data back to, for instance, an EPA region or a DoD entity and you need to check that EDD, that is largely what standalone EDP is used for. So the first stage in the standalone EDP workflow is to gather your EDD format file and your reference value file, and this will be given to you by the EQuIS data receiver or your client. You'll load these two files into standalone EDP on your desktop, and then you'll load your EDD into the application itself. At that time, standalone EDP will compare your EDD back to the format file, back to the reference value file, and it will also run all of those other quality checks that we went through in slide 2. If there are any errors, standalone EDP is great insofar that it offers you tools and an interface to fix the errors in place before you deliver the data back to your client. So if you have an invalid reference value or if you have an orphan record, standalone EDP will actually give you the tools to fix those data in place, create an EDD, a compliant EDD, and then submit it back to your client. So the last step, once all of your once all of your errors are resolved in your EDD, is to save it and then sign and submit it back to your client. And this can be done in any number of ways. Professional EDP workflow is very similar to standalone, except it's launched when you open the EQuIS Pro desktop application. So you'll launch EDP, launch the EQuIS data processor in EQuIS Professional, and load your format file. Since your reference values already exist in your database, there's no need to load an RVF. You'll load your EDD, and then you'll resolve your errors in place just like standalone EDP. At that time, once all of your errors are resolved and you have a complete and compliant EDD that conforms to all of your data quality checks, you'll be able to create the EDD in place, create the package, and then commit it to the database. It's important to note that professional EDP has a couple of different uses as well. Professional EDP is largely performed or used by the internal consultant. So if you have historical data that you're migrating into your EQuIS database, you may be using professional EDP, turning checks on and off in order to get your historical data into the database. Another example would be if you receive a qualified or a flagged EDD from a third-party validator, you may want to use one of professional EDP's different commit types, such as insert and merge, or insert and update, or update only. So you're really only updating the flags in your database or the qualifiers based on the findings of your third-party validator. So professional EDP really gives you flexibility with how you want to insert or integrate your new data into the database. And finally, enterprise EDP. Enterprise EDP is very much so different than professional and standalone. It does contain the same code and the same checks, but it's not manual. Enterprise EDP runs in the background. It performs these automated checks on data packages that are submitted either via email, uploaded through SFTP or an FTP site, or submitted directly through the EDP data loading widget on your enterprise dashboard. So again, the first step here would be for the data submitter to check their EDD using Standalone EDP, and then submit their EDD to Enterprise EDP using one of those three methods that we just discussed. One of the biggest differences between Standalone Professional and Enterprise is that Enterprise will verify the credentials and the permissions of the data submitter. So let's say that a data submitter is emailing an EDD. Enterprise EDP will link their credentials to that data package and store that in the database. It will also verify their permissions to make sure that they have valid data submitter permissions. Once those checks run in the background, the automated data quality checks run. If the EDD is accepted, the data submitter will receive an email with a confirmation of receipt and that the data have been committed to the database. If there are any errors in that EDD, and an example of an error that may be caught in Enterprise EDP but not in Standalone would be if your client changed a reference value on you without giving you a new reference value file, or if they changed something in their format without giving you a new format file. Enterprise EDP would catch this and let you know how to fix it. If there are any errors that it finds, it will send the data generator or the data submitter a detailed error report with row and record and field level instructions on how to fix that EDD. Once the errors are amended, you can resubmit the EDD and then receive a confirmation notification that it's been committed to the database. So why do we use EDP? Very simply put, high quality data leads to high quality deliverables. It's critical to understand that the importance of EQuIS and EDP is to provide the end user with a consistent data set of known quality. In other words, data quality is paramount and data quality resides above all. And it's important to note that data quality begins well before the laboratory in the planning phase. EDP will also help us avoid erroneous data during the reporting and analysis phases. An example of this is if you have a laboratory that performed multiple runs on a sample and they're reporting an analyte twice. If you didn't have EDP and the laboratory chose not to indicate whether it was a re-extraction, a run to, or a dilution of sorts, you would end up at the end in your reporting and analysis phase with what you would see as two duplicate results. But because those fields are required to be populated, EDP would screen them. It would notice if one of them is not populated, if one of those required fields is not populated, and it would let the data submitter know that they need to note, is this a dilution? Is this a run to? Is this a re-extraction for some reason? And that way, when you get to the end, you know what the most usable or highest quality result is for use in reporting and decision making. EDP also makes data validation a lot easier and reduces, the amount of unusable data. The way that EDP makes data validation easier is that it enforces all of those required fields or requires them to be populated before the data are allowed into the database. So whether it's a reporting limit, the way that your laboratory is reporting non-detects and how that's configured in EDP, or a matrix spike or spike duplicate or a field duplicate, all of the ways that these are reported are enforced using EDP. So if you require these fields to be reported by the laboratory, we're going to make sure that by the time the data reach our validator, they have all of the information they need to perform their data usability assessment, which leads to the next point of maintaining the legal defensibility or the audit trail of your data. With EDP, you have a level of transparency to see what checks are actually run on that data package. and exactly what was delivered to the data validator. So if your data ever go to court, God forbid, then you have to defend the legal defensibility of those data. EDP is very important to bring up in that case, because you can quote the exact quality checks and quality standards that were run or enforced on that EDD before it was allowed into the database. And finally, EDP helps put the responsibility of delivering compliant data back with the data submitter. And it's important to note here that EDP does not leave the laboratory or the data submitter in the dark. It actually gives you tools to fix the EDD in place if you need to do that. So again, to reiterate, high quality data leads to high quality deliverables, and EDP enforces this by checking data at every juncture. So the graphic here, we have Edge or Field EDP and Standalone EDP, and then we have a bit of a space between enterprise and professional. This space represents the fact that Field EDP and Standalone do not deliver directly to the EQuIS database. They're really the first round, they're the first level of checks that are performed on those data, again, whether it's field or analytical chemistry from your laboratory. Once the Field EDP and Standalone EDP complete their checks, the final say is had by either enterprise EDP or professional EDP. So you're getting a second level, a second round of checks that are linked directly to your database. Once it passes those checks, EDP will allow you to commit those data to the EQuIS database schema. So now we'll discuss the end-to-end EDP workflow. And this is near and dear to my heart. In a past life, I was a field geologist, so I was very used to gathering field data, usually on paper, and having to deal with missing or incomplete field documents when we got back into the office. So it's important to note here that data quality does start in the field. Edge, or the Field EDP, makes all of these workflows electronic, which allows for data completeness and checking. So whether it's sample collection, COCs, if you're establishing a new location, if you're installing a well, if you are a geologist logging soils behind a rig, gathering and describing lithology intervals, or if you're collecting field parameters, Field EDP will make sure that all of the required fields are populated before the sampler leaves the field. And we'll actually open up the Edge application here in just a few minutes and show you how this is done. So it's very important to note that this is the first juncture where data quality can and should be enforced. And that is what EDP helps us do, is maintain or enforce the completeness of the field data while our field techs are in the field. So the next portion of the EDP end-to-end workflow here is Standalone EDP, which again empowers labs to deliver better data. And it does not leave your laboratories in the dark. I keep harping on this. It's a very important point that Standalone and Professional EDP both give you an interface and tools to fix the EDD. It does not just give you a cryptic error report that you're not sure how to solve the errors. It lets you know exactly how to fix it down to a row and a record level, and it gives them tools to fix the EDDs in place, create the data package, and then commit it back to the database. Enterprise EDP, again, will automate the submissions and the commit and control types. Enterprise EDP includes automated data checking and error reporting. Again, if the data submitter submits their EDD with errors, Enterprise EDP will email them an error report, a very meaningful error report, and help them fix the errors in the EDD so they can resubmit and receive a confirmation of receipt for their records. Finally, Enterprise EDP has the final say before the data are allowed into EQuIS. Professional EDP, just to reiterate here, is going to help you manage submissions, review data, and control your commit types. Again, another couple examples of where professional EDP may be used in addition to migration of historical data. If you receive an updated EDD from the laboratory, if you notice that there may have been an error or there needed to be a resubmission for any reason, there are multiple commit types that help you update, whether it be inserting the data into the database, updating all of the records, only updating a few records, merging the new records with the old ones. There are multiple commit types in Professional EDP that allow you to get the data into the database in the way that you need to. And I'll use this example one more time, receiving a qualified or a flagged EDD from a third-party validator, the ability to just simply update the flags and the appropriate values in the database as they sit. So this is really the EDP end-to-end workflows in summary, from field, enforcing data quality in the field, making sure that our field documents and our field data are complete and compliant with our quality standards, moving to sending that information to the laboratory electronically. Again, you can do this using an ECOC. So if you have your samples planned, you send an ECOC to the laboratory at the end of the day. This reduces the amount of transcription errors that there are between logging samples into a LIMS in the laboratory, which is another way that we can enforce our data quality. The data are then going to be delivered back through enterprise EDP after they're run in standalone EDP. So we're enforcing data quality at about 4 junctures there before the data even get into the database. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the Edge application so we can see Field EDP in action. So for those of you who are not familiar with Edge, Edge is the EQuIS data gathering engine, and EQuIS supports the entire field workflow, whether it's well inspections, safety meetings, gathering of groundwater parameters, installing a well, logging soils behind a rig, collecting samples. Edge is a deep field application to support the entire field workflow. So prior to Edge, we've created what we call an SPM EDD, or we've planned our sampling event using the sample planning module. We've delivered that EDD to our field techs, and now our field techs are out in the field. They're going to load their EDD that the PM delivered to them, which will populate their task list in the left-hand pane here. Now, by loading that EDD, and you can see here that MW01 has now showed up in our task list in the left-hand pane, and we have an alert that says error. So if we click on this, we're walking up to MW01 in the field as a field tech. We click on this, and it's going to show us exactly the data that we planned to collect, and it's not going to let us out of the field until we collect the data. So until all of our boxes here are green, which is Field EDP functioning in the background, we should not be able to submit the data back to the database. So for instance, if I'm collecting a sample at MW01, I hook up to my low flow, or however I'm gathering my sample in here to fill out all of my information, and I realize that I do not have a sample date filled out. And that's noted by this red, red shading right here. So let's go ahead and put in a sample date on our tablet of today's date. Once I enter the sample date, I can enter a sample time as well. I'm on the West Coast, so I'll use West Coast time. And we can see here now that we do not have any red shading within the sample date field, and that our alert on the left-hand side in the left-hand pane has gone away. We can confirm this by going back to our home and seeing that all of our icons are now green. This is Field EDP indicating to us that we have now collected all of the required fields or the required data, and that we're ready to submit this back to the database. Now, this was a very trivial or rudimentary example, but I can tell you an example from my experience would be if you're logging soils behind a rig and you forget to log an interval. You log 1 to 5 feet, you log 5 to 12 feet, but you forget that 12 to 20 foot interval to log the lithology type. If you try to deliver that in Edge back to the database, it's going to throw an error and let you know in the field that you're missing those data. So you don't have to deal with that when you get back to the office. This is Field EDP enforcing the quality and the completeness of the data gathering before we get back into the office and before we submit our data back into EQuIS, which is another way that we guarantee or enforce that data quality, so we know that we're providing the end user with a consistent data set of known quality when we get to the decision-making stage. So at the end of our field workflow, once all of our items are green here, we would simply export this to EDP. We would save our EDD first. We can either export to standalone EDP. In this case, we don't need to because we were able to solve all of our issues. So using the button here in the bottom right-hand side, we would simply sign and submit our data. I would attach my user credentials To this, I would note which URL I'm submitting to or which email I'm submitting to get this data back into EQuIS. And then as soon as I send it off, it attaches my user credentials to the data package and it begins processing in Enterprise EDP, at which point, if it passes all of the checks, which it should because all of our items are green, the data are committed to the database. And you can view the data in EQuIS Professional or EQuIS Enterprise. So in summary, again, taking a look at this is the very beginning of where we start to enforce data quality, which is in the field. We want to make sure that our field techs are gathering complete data sets, that they're not forgetting little things like sample dates and sample times or dissolved oxygen reading when you're gathering your water quality parameters. And Edge can really help enforce completeness checking and quality checking on those data. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. And Liz, if you want to, I see we do have some comments in the right-hand pane, but I haven't pulled that up, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. And that is actually a request to go back and look at that workflow slide. I think that's your slide 9, so that we can see the EDP standalone and EDP enterprise workflow. So the request was to go back to it, but I want to check in and with Olu, did you have a specific question about that related to the slide, or did you just want to get another eyeball on there, maybe take a screenshot? Oh, just a screenshot. Okay, wonderful. I'm glad that's a compelling screenshot there for you. So yeah, absolutely. If you're interested, you and of course all the other attendees, I can of course include a copy of this slide deck and the delivery of the video as well. So excellent. All right, I don't see any additional questions. So I do also want to mention that all of the content that Taylor talked about is so wonderful and sort of, you know, a great overview of where everything sort of fits within the workflow and why you do certain things the way that you do and why, you know, EDP is designed to present things the way they are. But I also want to plug our Earthsoft Community Center because on our downloads page, you have access to some downloads of our former EQuIS Academy recordings. And there's an entire EDP subfolder that you can go check out that has those recordings available by skill level. So if you want to get a little bit deeper in the actual functionality and how to run each of those individual components of the workflow, there's more content there that you can check out. Sarah and John have a couple of questions here. John says a copy of the slides would be very helpful. So you bet, John, I'll go ahead and make sure that we include those. And Sarah asks if there's any information about the new EQuIS Collect module. Great question, Sarah. I don't know if Taylor can answer anything extra on that. We still are pretty, we haven't gotten a chance to get our hands on it yet because the developers are still working on it. As I understand it, EQuIS Collect allows you to basically take any EDD format and build basically Field EDD form out of it. So you aren't necessarily restricted just to the Edge format like you are with, you know, the Edge workflow. But I don't know, Taylor, do you have anything else that you can comment about that?
Sure. In terms of timeline, we're hoping for a beginning of Q2 release. We just held a user feedback forum, or I should say the development team. Alec Hage, who is leading the development of EQuIS Collect, just held a user feedback forum, and I believe that has been posted or will be posted to the community center. We're not quite demo ready in terms of the sales team yet. However, we can schedule demonstrations for organizations leveraging Alec and his team. But yeah, as a high level overview, different than Edge, EQuIS Collect is it really the heart of it is a custom form builder that allows you to build custom field forms for really collection of any type of data, whether or not it resides in EQuIS. Likely the data will reside in EQuIS. It could be biodiversity, it can be vegetation or wildlife monitoring, it can be field collection. It's going to be operational on any device. So whether it's iOS, Android, or a Windows phone, it'll be operating system agnostic. It'll be an app that you purchase in the App Store. You configure the forms in the office, and then you push them out to your field team. They collect data very similar to how they do in Edge, filling out the forms, and then they send it back to the database at the end of the day. So I'm sure Liz will let me know exactly who was asking the questions, but we will contact you, either myself or one of our other reps, to give you some more information on EQuIS Collect.
All right, so I don't see any additional questions sneaking in there. So Taylor, thank you so much. I would like to go over some of the additional logistics here of the rest of the on-demand presentation. So if you don't mind, I'll steal presenter back from you. So if you have not attended a simulated live, we dropped a couple of these towards the end of the year when we were approaching the holidays. So I'd like to officially explain how the function of these guys work. So first, the registration links to register for those, I'll go ahead and paste those in the chat window here in just a second. But they'll also be available from that handouts pane. You can go ahead and retrieve those. There's a PDF there that has a link to each of those as well. So after you register for those sessions, you can watch them again as though they were live, or you can watch them the first time rather, as though they were live basically for the next month through the end of February. You can even queue them up and binge watch them like they're your new favorite show if you're so inclined, okay? In these simulated live sessions, you can submit questions to us directly in the webinar. There's a little question pane in it, just like you see in today's webinar, but you won't be able to pause, fast forward, or rewind, just as though it was a live session. I will say there's actually kind of a sneaky way that you can fast forward. You can speed up the playback speed, so you can get everybody who's presenting talking like a chipmunk, but it doesn't have the same like ease of fast forward and pause like a typical downloaded file would be. But fear not, you can expect an email in your inbox with the recording about 24 hours after you've registered and started watching the session, and that recording will have all the pause and fast forward and rewind functionalities. So we'd like to know how you like this as a new format. If you like it or you don't, or whatever, you can certainly send us a message either directly in session, which ultimately ends up in my email box anyway, or you can email officehours@earthsoft.com as well. So finally, as always, if you have future office hour topic suggestions that you'd like to see, please tell us. I know we always say this, but we really always mean it. We are always looking for new content to share with you that's meaningful to you. So I think that basically ties us up to the end of it. So I want to give a big thanks again to Taylor. Thanks so much for presenting. And I really loved seeing this, alternative way to consider the EDP workflow sort of end to end. And thank you everyone for your attendance. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or if you'd like to present a case study perhaps, or would like to sign up for a future office hour, you can email us again at officehours@earthsoft.com. So thanks so much for your attendance today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.